So a couple of things to note before we get started. This webinar does not cover using DCED's single application for assistance. Um, for guidance on this part of the Keystone Grant process, you can watch our video tutorial that's available on the PHMC YouTube channel. We've prepared that video that I just mentioned. You can get to that link through the PDF of the presentation that was sent out with your reminder email. Also remember, at any time during the application process, additional support is available from DCED's Customer Service Center during normal business hours by telephone or email. We've also built in some links to the program guidelines, fact sheets, and where to go information within the application itself to find the help that you need. So some quick housekeeping items that we'll get out of the way quickly. We have a lot of people joining us today, which is fabulous, which means that everybody will remain muted and all questions should be asked in the chat function. We'll take breaks throughout the webinar for questions. If you have specific questions about a specific project, such as eligibility or whether or not something is fundable under this program, that's best to have in an offline conversation with grant staff. As I noted before, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing the week of January 18th at the latest on PHMC's YouTube channel. You will get a follow-up email after this webinar that includes the link to that video for you. Now I will turn it over to Karen Arnold to talk about the construction category grants.
Thank you, Shelby. Of course, if you're tuning in today, you're interested in applying to the Commission for an actual brick and mortar grant application. So these would be ones that you're actually physically planning to hire a contractor who will make a change to the building or landscape. Please note that the building must be National Register listed or considered an eligible property for listing in the National Register. And this category accepts higher requests from $5,000 to $100,000. All projects have to have a cash match, so that really means that your project costs are really $10,000 to $200,000 at the minimum. We are a state agency, so your project will need to follow the Pennsylvania Prevailing Wage Act, which might impact the cost of your labor. So please keep that in mind while you're preparing your project budget or assembling estimates. Next slide, please. So eligible activities under the construction category, it's available to all projects that follow the preservation, restoration, or rehabilitation treatment standards. As you can see from the categories on the slide, which I see some people are having difficulties with. So please know that we'll be recording this, so you'll be able to see it afterwards. So your eligible activities are anything that follows the building from foundation to the roof. Mechanical systems, interiors, exterior projects, either thermal moisture protection that includes roofing, flashing, gutter systems. If you're not sure, you can certainly check out the program fact sheet for further explanation for the potential areas and how to address them in your budget as well. But again, this is a full comprehensive capital project that would be coming into as an application in this category. Next slide, please.
Karen, I'm sorry. I just want to pause for a moment and see if we can get this issue resolved. Everybody, it looks here like they're having problems viewing the slides. So okay. I am going to try to stop sharing and then reshare. So if you could just bear with us for a minute. Maybe while I am doing that, everybody in the conversation chat box can tell us where they're joining us from or what organization they're they're with.
Wow, that's great to see everyone from so far around. Thank you for joining us. I see some names of people I recognize, so it's great to see you again, and past grantees, and some new faces. That's great.
All right, we are going to try this again. And hopefully we will have a smoother time of it. I appreciate everybody's patience this morning. Just when you think that well-oiled wheel is just going to go right ahead and work without problems, it likes to throw you a bit of a curveball. So my slides are still loading. This is great that everybody is sharing with us where they're coming from. It looks like literally all over the Commonwealth. All right. Can everyone see my slides now?
I can again, and we were at slide 7, Shelby.
Yes.
We've got some coming in. Well, the nice thing is if you aren't able to see the slides, you are able to follow along from the PDFs that were the handouts that came in the other day. That's always a nice workaround if we're still having difficulty.
All right, I'm not sure why we're having some connectivity issues. They may not be on our end, they may be on your end. So again, I apologize. Karen, why don't we proceed since we do have a lot of information to cover. You can follow along in that PDF. As Karen mentioned, we will also be recording this, and I'm also going to put the PDF, a link to that document again here in the chat box while Karen is talking, so hopefully we can get you the visuals to go along with this presentation. So again, my apologies. Karen, you want to start again at slide 7?
Sure, thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. The best laid plans don't always come out the way we want them. So what I do want to point out some items that are not eligible for funding and that were originally excluded both from the grant guidelines and the enabling legislation of the grant program. Obviously, we're not able to fund new construction, so it's just really directed to historic buildings and extant historic buildings. So we're also not able to fund reconstructed construction projects. So if you've got a building that might have been disassembled because of a project that was going to impact it and you wanted to reconstruct it at a new location, that also is not eligible under this program. Routine and cyclical maintenance are also considered ineligible, so that would cover things like painting and caulking where you're not including a carpentry component, or mowing at a historic cemetery. New construction activities of non-historic features such as parking lots, sidewalks, curb cuts, and things like that are also ineligible. And activities that would be best follow under the planning project category, such as archaeology or pre-development work, are actually excluded. If you have aspects of that project rolled into a larger construction project, we do ask that you separate them, phase them, and apply for them in different application rounds. We're certainly happy to support both aspects of that project, but unfortunately they need to be sequenced and you can't roll them into one application. Grant funding may not be used to acquire buildings or land, even though our sister agency with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources Keystone program allows that. The PHMC guidelines do prohibit such activities. Next slide, please. Thank you. An eligibility reminder, of course, Applicants must be nonprofit organizations, usually organized as a 501c3 by the IRS, or municipalities who own and operate historically and publicly accessible properties. The enabling legislation does require that the organization must have been in existence for 5 years prior to the date of the application. Basically want to make sure that your organization is well-heeled, has the financial support and capacity to complete the project. If you're not, we do allow you to work with a fiscal sponsor who would then be the applicant. Also, all the funding would pass through them, but it's a way to make sure that your project can be completed if it certainly needs to follow a certain timeline or has to keep the momentum going for your within your community, or has a dire condition issue. Now, I do say that the property must be accessible to the public. We use the rule of thumb that they're open at least 100 days. If it isn't, you're able to articulate in your application how this project will improve access to the property, either buildings or the grounds. So remember, if you're a museum with limited public access, our panelists do consider that when making those recommendations for funding. We know that the world has changed a lot in the last 11 months. So if you're using visitation numbers, which are asked for in the application, consider using your pre-COVID-19 visitation numbers, or facts from calendar year 2019 for your visitation numbers. You're also able to share within the what your virtual programming may have been, or outreach that you've done and offered over this last calendar year, to help solidify that you're an organization that will be able to see and continue their programming at the end of this. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to April to talk a little bit about the National Register requirements that I just mentioned.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So the Keystone Grant's enabling legislation requires that the funding focus on historic resources defined as eligible for or listed in the National Register of Historic Places. To qualify for a Keystone Grant, properties must be formally listed in the National Register, either individually or as a contributing resource within a listed historic district, or they must have been evaluated by our office and found to be eligible for listing. Our evaluation must have been made within the past 5 years. Next slide. Before you begin your grant application, you'll need to find out if your property is individually listed or is contributing to a listed district, or if it's not listed, whether our staff have ever evaluated it. You can find this out through our online database. If the property is listed or is part of a listed district, you're good to go. You just need our database's SHPO ID number for the property to add to the application. If the property is not in our records, or we have a limited record without much detail, you'll need to submit a resource survey form soon to have the property's National Register eligibility evaluated. If the property has been evaluated and was found to be eligible, but that was more than 5 years ago, you'll need to provide updated info to have us confirm the property's eligible status. You can contact our National Register staff for guidance about what type of updated info you'll need to provide. It will vary based on the existing info that we have and the property itself. Next slide. If you need to submit a resource survey form or updated info, a standard National Register eligibility evaluation takes about 30 days. So you do need to do this by the last week of January so that your property's eligibility status is confirmed prior to the grant deadline. You can be working on the grant application while you wait for the results of our evaluation, or working on both the resource survey form and your grant application at the same time if necessary. Next slide. Be aware that just because the property is recognized locally and has a plaque or is within a locally designated district, the property may not have National Register status or may have never been evaluated for the National Register. Check our online database to confirm the property's National Register status. Next slide. Also, while there are over 3,000 Pennsylvania properties and districts listed in the National Register, only about 170 of those are also National Historic Landmarks. That's a special distinction in addition to a National Register designation, and it's separate from the National Register program, but our online database will also show that status. Next slide. So just to quickly recap, two of the first things you should be doing as you consider applying for a grant are to look up our ID number for the property and confirm what your property's current National Register status is. The property needs to be either listed in the National Register individually or as part of a district, or eligible for the National Register and evaluated or confirmed as eligible within the past 5 years. Use our current online database, CRGIS, to look up the property's ID number and confirm whether it's listed within a listed district, recently evaluated as eligible, or if you need to submit a complete resource survey form or updated info. All applications, regardless of your property status, will require the property's SHPO ID number, sometimes also known as a key number, and you can find that in CRGIS. If, after looking up your property in our CRGIS program, you still aren't sure what its status is, or if you think you need to submit a resource survey form or updated info, please contact our staff and do that soon. We want you to be able to meet the deadline. When contacting a National Register staff person, please do so via email if possible, so that you can include the name of the property and the current full street address that you're interested in, so we can look that up for you. Also, be sure you note in your email that this is related to an upcoming grant application, just so we know what direction we're going. Okay, Shelby or Karen, I think that's it for right now. We're going to take a little pause to ask any or address any questions.
Thank you, April. Everybody who is following along on the PDF, we are at about slide 15 or page 15, so we've gone through that first set. We do have a couple of questions that have come in that I think are ones, I believe, for Karen to answer. The first question, is roofing considered routine or cyclical?
Usually not. The expenditures that go along with roofing, we do consider them capital projects. So things to keep in mind: if it's just a limited repair of maybe a loose slate or two, that would not be covered. But if it's a full repair of a large amount of water leakage that's going to require removal of slate to address the flashing beneath it, no, that is certainly a capital project.
Okay, great. We have another question. Are covered bridges covered?
Yes, and I like that the turn of phrase. Most of the covered bridges in Pennsylvania were listed in the National Register under a multiple property documentation, so they do have National Register status. As long as they're publicly accessible and under some kind of public ownership, they would be eligible for funding. We do fund quite a few of them, either abutment repairs, some kind of repairs to the roofing or structural system as well. I know that one of the next questions, Shelby, if you want me to just go ahead, I can.
Yes, please.
Was dealing with the fiscal sponsor, and if you're asked to be a fiscal sponsor and you already had a plan to submit your own application, our guidelines do allow separate subunits to be applicants and to have multiple applications. I certainly would not encourage you to submit 5, but if you're asked and it's 5 and it's maybe 2 applications, and you can certainly document that it's a different subunit that is being prepared, yes, that would certainly be an eligible application, and you can submit more than one.
All right, we have one. What does it mean for your property if you are registered? Are there restrictions to updates that you can do to your building based on the time period the building was built? Oh, I see. Answer. April addressed that. National Register listing does not place any restrictions or obligations on private properties. So in the interest of time, I will move on to the next question. Are there alternative options to Keystone grant funding for buildings who repeatedly have been denied National Register status?
Well, it certainly depends largely on the type of project that you're coming through. I mean, unfortunately, there is limited funding for historic preservation, and it almost always is tied to National Register eligibility. But for state funding, if it's a program issue that you might be able to secure funding through the Department of Community and Economic Development for certain earmarked programs, depending on what the use is. And we can probably talk offline, Laura, about what issues that you might be having.
We have a couple of questions that all relate to what would be covered. Karen, can you just say a quick word about interpretive signage or mausoleum stained glass windows if a cemetery is eligible for listing?
Okay, and you also had one about fencing as well from Erin.
Yep,
and
thank you.
I would imagine that the type of fencing that you're talking about is sort of that standard chain link fencing that might protect a resource. I would imagine that would follow under sort of a non-historic element and most likely would not be eligible for funding. If it's fencing like a historic cemetery that included decorative hairpin fencing, that's restoration that would be eligible. I know it's kind of splitting a hair, but I would imagine that modern fencing would be considered with like parking lots. Unfortunately, interpretive signage is not eligible under our grant program. We've tried to expand our eligible activities quite a bit, but education and interpretive programming has always been excluded from the comptroller under our program. Not really completely sure why, but they do want to earmark as much of this activity as possible to capital projects, which would then exclude interpretive signage. And stained glass windows in a mausoleum. If the cemetery is eligible for the National Register, and you can certainly see and enjoy the stained glass windows from the exterior, I would imagine that yes, they are. If it's a mausoleum that is locked and has very little accessibility, I think you might get into a little bit of a wiggle room, but as long as the cemetery as a whole is open and you can actually view the stained glass from the outside, I think it would be fine.
Okay, great. Thank you, Karen. We did have a few more questions come in, but in the interest of time, I am going to ask that we move on, and you can certainly follow up with Karen via email or a phone call to get the answers to your specific questions. So we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. For those of you following along in the PDF, we'll be starting with the slides titled Funding Priorities. Karen?
Thank you, Shelby. So obviously, we're not able to support all projects and applications that come into our queue, but Shelby, the slide needs to advance if you haven't done so already. There, thank you. So we are, because we aren't able to fund everything that we do receive, we do tend to gravitate to projects that are very visible, that are primarily preservation or restoration activities. So much like that question regarding the mausoleum, usually aspects of the project that have a more public or viewing are more easily to get attention. So if you're coming to us to rehabilitate a staff break room kitchen, that certainly does not have the same pull or excitement that maybe the restoration of a bell tower might have at a historic church. We do like projects that have and can demonstrate a wide public support and benefit. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But finally, we also are as part of that, are tied to making a priority for those projects that are able to articulate that they're tied to the Pennsylvania Preservation Plan. If you're not familiar with the plan, you certainly can view it and read it at your leisure through this link in our presentation. But our plan is something that we prepare every 5 years as a mandate to our funding from the National Park Service. It includes a lot of public input to create these goals and the companion action items to help Pennsylvania foster preservation throughout the Commonwealth. All of our Keystone funded projects must somehow implement the plan, and we want our applicants to explain how their project furthers these goals and implements the plan as a way. Our grant review panel are asked to evaluate the responses in all their selection process, and we get a wide variety of them, and that's perfectly fine and quite exciting to see how you see yourself in the plan. Next slide, please, Shelby. The plan is really quite long, which included a lot of work by our staff and the public at large who helped us build it. But it's really tied to four different goals, and each goal has 5 or 6 action items. In a way to kind of help you, we've also, within the application and presentation, articulated them pretty briefly, and so that you can see yourself in the plan and your project in the plan. I do encourage you to read through the plan as a whole, and we again, if you can't find this presentation when you're working it, there's also a link in the application that will help you get access to it. Next slide, please. I think I'm going to kick this over to Corey then to talk about our certified local government, which is also one of our funding priorities too.
Thanks, Karen. The Certified Local Government Program is a voluntary designation program that communities that have active and formalized local preservation programs, generally characterized by having some sort of historic preservation ordinance and a architectural review board or a preservation commission or a historical commission in place to evaluate changes to buildings within locally designated resources. This is a sort of a good housekeeping stamp of approval for communities who implement effective practices for that local program. One of the benefits that participating communities who in the CLG program receive is that applicants from within those municipalities get bonus points on their Keystone applications if they have a letter of support from their local government, from the municipality, accompanying their Keystone application. There are currently 45 certified local governments in Pennsylvania. They're scattered throughout the Commonwealth. Most of them are in the southeastern part of the state, but we do have quite a number in the central and western stretches of the state. And you can find a list along with contact information for all of those participating communities at the link you see here in the slides. What we ask is, as part of the application, that the municipality provide a letter addressed to Karen that indicates support for the particular application in order to receive the bonus points. These points would also apply to the municipality itself if they are applying, not just the nonprofits within it. So just to sort of summarize that, these points are available for the local government, but also organizations within these participating municipalities, so that everybody can kind of benefit from the community's commitment to preservation. If your community is not a certified local government already, there's probably not time to complete that process before the March 1st application deadline for the 2021 round, but it is something that myself or my colleagues Bill Callahan in Western Pennsylvania or Brian Van Sweden in the central Pennsylvania would be happy to talk to you about developing and implementing for your communities for the future. So, thank you.
Thank you, Corey. In talking about how our projects are selected for funding, I think it's really important to share with you how our review and evaluation process goes, just so that you can keep that in mind as you're preparing your application. Although internal staff initially confirms National Register requirements and eligibility requirements of the organization, the applications themselves are actually reviewed by a peer outside grant panel. I share this really as a reminder that you want to make sure that you explain the significance of the resource and your programming with the review panel in the application. Although our internal staff might be very familiar with your site, but the grant review panel may not be. So it's really helpful to you to explain the significance and the history of the building or site, as well as how it's used and how the community benefits from you. The grant review panel themselves are comprised of preservation architects, municipal officials, HARBs or CLG. HARB is a Historic Architectural Review Board, or certified local government members, staff from our heritage parks in Pennsylvania, and other preservation consultants. They're regionally dispersed across the Commonwealth. We feel that really gives us the opportunity to have outsiders who are more in tune with what's happening in the local community, help guide our selection process. In addition to having regional distribution of the panel members, we also divide applications throughout them. So in other words, the panelists who might be located in the western part of the state won't just review the western applications. We sort of combine them within the multiple application panels to make sure that there's an equal number of resource types, national historic landmarks, or a regional distribution of applications that they see in their specific panels. Our panelists are professionals. They're well-versed in preservation or construction methodologies, and they're very often were project members of our past grant-funded projects. Next slide, please. Finally, what also will help you draft your project narratives to understand the evaluation criteria that we ask our grant review panelists to look at. Obviously, they look at the application and how well it's prepared. Specifically, how much planning has gone into whether or not you've pulled together your project team. They've already evaluated sort of a conditions assessment or what's really necessary at the building, what other projects that you've been doing as part of your stewardship, and making the priority that this next one that you're asking for grant funding is the one that's next in the sequence. Obviously, this project narrative and the requested attachments are really designed to help the panelists evaluate our applications fairly, and I don't want you to forget about these things, so we do have them linked in the program fact sheet, as well as instructions and maybe guidance of what you want to consider to sort of demonstrate how you've done your preliminary planning or your project. And keep in mind, as I also talk about as part of your planning, to pay close attention to your budget preparations. Costs included within this and the budget will follow your grant project once it's under contract and throughout the project. So you really want to make sure that the overall project costs are relevant and realistic. So you should be working with a design professional to build what your budget is, and even working and getting estimates with contractors to make sure that you're really following along. And don't forget that we're a state agency, so our funding will most likely trigger the Pennsylvania Prevailing Wage Act, and which might change the costs of your project depending on where you're located. Since I mentioned a design professional and your project team, I'm going to kick the presentation over to Sean to talk a little bit more about how that can benefit your project as a whole.
Thanks, Karen. Hello, everyone. So due to the requirements and regulations and standards of this program, the grant program, the contract will require professional oversight. Topics that will need to be addressed by the applicant include preparation and vetting of plans and specifications for the proposed project. And this is usually done prior to the application to ensure that there is true understanding of the complexities of the project. The applicant will also need to prepare a project budget, like Karen recently said. This project budget should include or allow for construction management costs, which is capped at 20% the total project cost. Also, you should design a project approach that demonstrates alternatives were considered within the project, and the methodology is the appropriate treatment standard. If applicable, the applicant will need to attach historic structure reports, do condition assessments and plans, and really the proposed project is a recommendation of these documents, the condition assessments and plans. and the project is not contractor driven, but appropriately evaluated holistically. Next slide, please. So there's some things to note. It's important, obviously, to have a design professional involved, as we mentioned before. And if you are not certain if you have adequate planning for the project, please consider applying for a project grant to hire the consultants needed to assess the situations and the complexities of your project. Also, you should include resumes and CV with similar projects in the applications. You should have primary project personnel, and you should include the experience with those similar projects. Next slide, please. So with these design professionals, it is important to find the right project team. Some things that the applicant can use to do this is to look into relationships of individuals who have previous experience working with the site. Also, previous experience with project managers or site personnel of the particular project. You can also look into referrals, so word of mouth from individuals, from other design professionals, and from similar sites or properties that are related or closely related to the project that you're doing. You can also go, obviously, online and do research about design professionals. There's some search engines out there that can be very useful to find the right person that you need. You can also go to the Client's Resource Tools tab at your local AIA chapter. And you can also gain leads from design and construction magazines of similar projects. Next slide, please. So the applicant and owner should choose team members that have these important characteristics. They should be experienced with historical buildings design and construction methods and materials. They should be experienced with the Secretary of Interior Standards and guidelines for treatments of historic properties, and they must be able to provide adequate and comprehensive documentation to support and explain the proposed project. Also, they must be able to provide a resume and CV that reflects experience directly relating to the proposed project.
Thanks, Sean. Since Sean did mention the standards for the treatment of historic properties just recently, for those who might not be familiar with those, the standards are a set of 10 guidelines that are designed to identify and preserve the important or character-defining features of a historic building. Sometimes those are articulated within the National Register documentation, but also your design professional or project team have probably already identified what are the aspects of a property that make it historically important. So as you're developing a capital project or a construction project, we want to make sure that those aspects, or what makes the historic building historic, are retained as part of the project. So even after your application, we do, as the Commission, are required to review and approve all of the construction project prior to beginning. So if it's just being funded for our Keystone grant, I, as the grant staff, will review it. But if you're also secured other state or federal funding as part of your match, we'll do a collaborative review with our environmental review staff to make sure that you're in compliance with the standards. Please know that we may need to negotiate the scope of work to bring it in compliance with the standards, such as if you're proposing to replace a slate roof with a synthetic sort of architectural line asphalt shingle, and we might want to be able to support your project, but unfortunately the material selection does not meet the standards. standards, we might come back to you with a request to change the product to a higher level synthetic slate or architectural line shingle that would be more appropriate to the building. If you're not familiar with the standards, they're way too robust to talk about in our webinar this morning, but we have a nice link here for you to access the National Park Service site. Shelby, if you want to advance the slide as well. You can also go to additional help with the technical preservation services of the Park Service, who have prepared standard guidelines for interpreting the standards, specific case studies that deal with the standards, as well as very handy preservation briefs, which, although most have been prepared in the 80s, are still very relevant because they're dealing with historic building materials. Next slide, please. One of our other aspects of how we evaluate properties is to talk about the community benefit as part of your project. Again, that's very important as we evaluate it. We are attracted to projects that are visible in the community and will have a strong impact. We certainly want to help projects that might not get finished without our financial commitment, or that our involvement will make a difference in the long-term preservation in the property, or even better yet, be able to leverage additional grant funding from the community. Don't forget that we certainly, in all aspects of our grant program, want to enhance the community's understanding of a specific historic resource or preservation in general. How you demonstrate that in your application, there's a whole section that talks about your community support and benefit, but we also ask you to talk about or provide letters of support that sort of showcases the broad spectrum of community impact. When you're anticipating who should author your letter of support, think outside your immediate membership group. We certainly want to see that it's going to benefit more than just your immediate group. If you have a clubhouse, of course your members a membership will benefit. What about the school group that comes and visits or participates in a programming that really benefits? That's sort of the path that you should consider when talking about your letters of support. Our grant review panels do very much read them because they do demonstrate how important your project is to the community. So make sure that they're current, they're directed to the right grant program, or because they do notice if it's directed to another funding program. Don't hesitate to reach out to your local elected officials, both your state legislators. We do like you to talk and have that conversation with them. It's great for them to know what's going on in their district and be familiar with not only you but our grant program, but also don't forget sort of those community letters of support. They really do make an impact. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk about real briefly, because I know we're running short of time, but what makes a competitive application. Don't hesitate to reach out to our staff. If you're not sure if your project meets the grant guidelines, or if there's an aspect that might be more beneficial to talk about, both myself, our community preservation community coordinators such as Corey, Brian Van Sweden, and Bill Callahan are happy to talk to you about what your project needs. We can certainly make suggestions for you. Remember to be concise but complete in all applications. So if you're potentially proposing to repair windows, don't just tell us that they'll be repaired, but tell us how your contractor plans to repair them, how the carpenter will repair them. If they're too deteriorated to repair and have to be replaced, we'd like to see that you've looked at alternatives. This is the best path forward, but more importantly, that your proposed windows are appropriate and will match the historic ones that are being replaced with. Our well-planned projects are certainly the ones that get funded. They have a well-versed project team in place. They have explored options. They understand the complexities of the project. That sequencing has been done in the proper order so that you're not necessarily applying to repair interior decorative plaster, but you haven't identified or repaired the exterior water leak that has caused it. We certainly want to see that demonstrated as you prepare your application. I do encourage you again to be working with a design professional and that they're looking at real numbers, that you're not necessarily proposing to repair a brick wall, but your budget only has $200. Well, that sort of articulates that either you're not explaining the complexity of the project, or there's not a full understanding that there might be a larger project behind it. And because the worst thing we don't want to see is that you haven't requested enough money to actually start a project, but yet can't finish it. Finally, photographs. I realize that an image really says so much. It can explain the importance of your resource, so make sure you include a nice overall photograph, but don't forget the detailed photographs. Since we were talking about a window a short time ago, show some detailed photographs of that rot on the window that needs to be replaced, or it doesn't operate and that the window is wrecked. I mean, it certainly helps demonstrate it. I know we had an application a few years ago from a smaller community historical society that was housed in a former church, and the application was to restore a structurally unsound bell tower. Their photograph was a wonderful shot across the valley where you could see how visible this church was, but you could also see how out of line and dangerous the steeple was becoming, and it certainly created a sense of urgency for the grant review panel and that they wanted to support the project. They're wonderfully helpful. We certainly appreciate being able to see how wonderful your historic resource is, and the grant review panel certainly appreciates that. Next slide, please. Things to keep in mind with if you are selected for funding, you are expected to execute a grant contract. Remember that there are some standard provisions within all Commonwealth that include prevailing wage, accessibility, non-discrimination, sexual harassment provisions. If you're not sure what those are or would like to see that, I'm happy to share a template with you. Remember that all your plans and specifications have to be submitted for approval prior to construction, and that your scope of work may need to be negotiated to bring it in compliance with the standards. Finally, those projects that are coming in under the construction category are required to sign a declaration of covenant with the Commonwealth within 45 days of execution of the grant contract. This is a legal document that's recorded at the Recorder of Deeds office. As the organization and the Commonwealth are agreeing that all future work will be done in consultation with the PHMC, that it will meet the standards, and that the building will remain open to the public and in good repair. We will not issue any reimbursements until that covenant is signed. If you as the applicant are not actually the property owner, I would encourage you to make sure that you have these conversations with your property owner and their solicitor now. It's not negotiable. We will not be able to fund your project if the covenant does not will not be signed. And again, I'm happy to share it with you, and it's not in perpetuity. It's commensurate with the amount of funding that you're requesting from us. At most, it's a 15-year term under the grant program. Additional requirements: we do like to stay up to date with your project, so we do ask for quarterly reporting and reimbursements requests. Most importantly, I don't know that I mentioned that this is not a direct reward. This is a reimbursable grant, so you will be making periodic reimbursements as you have expenses. And then finally, we do ask for a final report and final work products to be submitted to be able to close out your grant project. Finally, next slide, Shelby. Where to go for next additional support in the next couple weeks. You can view the grant guidelines at any time on our website. Just select Preservation and Grants and Funding and look for the construction project tile to get you to the grant guidelines. We have these YouTube videos we're told by our applicants are very helpful. You can refer to them at any time on the PHMC YouTube channel. Please feel free to reach out to me. I've provided my phone number and email address. Although our staff is working remotely, I am able to access both email and phone during normal business hours. If you have difficulty with the website and the portal for the applications, I might not be the best person to reach out. I can answer you some quick questions, but the wonderful staff at DCED's Customer Service Center are very well versed and have probably run into all sorts of problems with applications in the past, and they should be able to help you either navigate why an attachment might not be uploading, or why you can't get access to the system otherwise. And it does stay open until midnight on March the 1st, so you have plenty of time. But I and the customer service staff will not be working that late. We most likely will be able to get support until 5 p.m. that day, so please feel free to start working on your application now. It is open. And we've also tried to anticipate some of your questions. So there are helpful links throughout the application, either within links in the application or the program addendum, or also in the program fact sheet with that. Shelby, do you want to open it up for questions again?
Yes, I will, Karen. We had a few come in. Is archaeological investigation prior to any ground disturbance associated with construction, such as utility lines, foundation work, etc., an allowable expense under this grant? Archaeological resources are obviously important for National Register listed and eligible historic properties.
We like to see a lot of that investigation coming separately under the planning category, and those are capped at $25,000. We might need to talk about your sequencing because certainly we don't want to necessarily open something up and then leave it sit for another hour, or not hour, a year before you can come in for a construction category. But for the most part, we like them in the other category, but we can talk offline about your specific situation.
Another question. We are looking at rewiring original light fixtures and replacing electric receptacles. Is it okay to add additional electric receptacles to better accommodate public programming and or add the use of LEDs?
Yes, that's certainly understandable. That would be necessary, and actually would help certainly enhance your programming, and we would see that as a related project.
All right. We had a question, are environmental reviews required?
Well, this is technically state funding, so yes, most of it is handled by grant staff, myself. We do evaluate it, or if for cultural review. Environmental review sometimes includes other aspects, which sometimes are also tied to your other funding sources too. But for the most part, we're only concerned with making sure that the cultural review coming through is appropriate to the historic building. I'm not sure I answered that.
Maybe that's a great question for maybe an offline conversation. I'm going to ask one or two more, and then we will wrap it up for today since we are quickly approaching 11 o'clock. Can a local municipality apply for a private for-profit owner?
It happens occasionally. They usually are not very well received in the grant review panel. You'd have to make the case of why the municipality is making this application on behalf of to benefit a private individual. That's usually why they're not very well received. Since the application process is so competitive, they tend not to be ranked very high because they would prefer that our normal partners are the ones receiving consideration and financial support who might not have the avenue. If it's a stabilization of a very important historic building, it might be a different situation where you're investigating whether ownership is being transferred to a nonprofit who would continue that ownership. That's a slightly different situation, and that might be better received. But if it's a standard one way to get around the eligibility requirements, that's not necessarily what the intent of the grant program is.
All right, thank you, Karen. We did have we had two questions come into chat, one from Devin and one from Nancy Ross. Karen, maybe you can answer those in chat quickly or ask them to follow up offline while I take care of our last few slides and wrap this up since we promised everybody we'd be done by 11. All right, so I just wanted to quickly mention, I'm going to go through these next few slides very quickly, but absolutely happy to talk with anybody offline. If you want to get in touch with us via email, If one of my colleagues could add my email address in the chat conversation for you so you can get in touch with me. Just wanted to let you know about two different initiatives we have currently going on at the PA SHPO. The first is our Community Initiative Award. This is an annual award that we started in 2016 is one of the ways that we implement our statewide historic preservation plan. These awards recognize the hard work and dedication of organizations, municipalities, agencies, individual, and others whose work embodies the theme of that plan, as I mentioned. You're looking here at the screen at the 2019 recipients that demonstrated the value of preserving iconic places and community landmarks through ownership and stewardship. And maybe if another one of my colleagues can give you a quick rundown of who those awardees are, I will move on. We're going to be announcing the 2020 awardees in the next few weeks. Like most other things, COVID gave us a little bit of a hiccup in moving these forward this year, but we are still continuing them. You can learn more about these awardees that you see here on the screen and others through our blog at pahistoricpreservation.com if you just do a quick search for community. If you're wondering how this applies to you, well, certainly our grantees through the Keystone program and many other groups and individuals and organizations throughout the Commonwealth are doing really amazing work, and we want to know about that and we want to celebrate it. And that's a very easy way for you to let us know that, and by letting us know about the great work you're doing, you are likely then eligible for a community initiative award from our office. It's very simple. Just simply use the hashtag preservation happens here in any of your social media posts, or there's an online form that you can use to tell us about your preservation happens here story or your success story through that SurveyMonkey link. But after February 22nd, you'll be able to tell us about your success stories and preservation happens here stories through PA Share, which is just the next set of information that I'll talk with you about today. There's nothing that you need to think about or worry about with PA Share related to the Keystone grants this year. This is an initiative. This is a program that'll be launching on February 22nd, 2021. This is going to be replacing CRGIS, which will go offline March 1st, so you have plenty of time to still be able to access CRGIS and get the information you need for your Keystone grants. PA Share is really an integrated planning tool for our office where you can get access to data for information and planning. You can submit and track projects online and have the added convenience and efficiency of a mobile data collection tool for things like survey and managing those big survey projects where you're looking at dozens and dozens or hundreds and hundreds of properties at one time. We will have different types of access or points of access for everybody interested in using PA Share. Guest and Basic have free access. We do have subscription accounts that provide a lot of convenient and helpful features for you as well. You can get more information on those things on our website. If you just go to the PA Share tab of the PHMC website, things you can do now to get ready for PA Share on the 22nd is getting your Keystone login if you need one, and sign up for our PA Share newsletter, certainly following along in the blog. And if you get our newsletters, you'll also be getting lots of updates about in-person, online, and on-demand training. I see Corey's added a note in there with my email and with those 2019 winners. Thank you very, very much, Corey. I appreciate that. I know I went through that super, super fast. We're 5 minutes over, so we're going to wrap it up. Here, I will leave this slide right here. These links will be active in the PDF that you received via email and that some of you have been using to follow along today. As always, please reach out to me, Karen, any of our presenters here today, really anybody on staff, and we're happy to answer your questions. Karen, anything else or anything else from our other presenters before we go offline?
Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I think it's really helpful to have a nice opportunity to kind of talk about the basics of the grant program. I thank you to my co-presenters and to Shelby for setting this up for you. And don't hesitate to reach out if you still have further questions that we didn't address in this training.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We will sign off. Have a great day. Thank you.